Welcome to my talk, Vulnerability Management, the Bad, the Ugly, and the Good. First and foremost, who am I and why my talk? Since you already got a little bit of intro from Heidi, I'm just going to speed through my intro slide. Hi, my name is Leomi, pronouns they, them. I've been a Minnesotan for 6 years. My first actual interaction post-move in this lovely state was at DevOps Days 2018. I've been in tech for a long time, but security has always been along for the ride in some way. And my favorite thing to do is to get non-security people to understand security so that it's more people-powered. So yeah, that's the reason I'm here and not at Hacker Summer Camp right now, so you're welcome. So, what I'm here to talk about and why I'm here to talk about it. To explain that, let's roll time back. It's November 1st, 2017, and I'm giving my first keynote at LISA 17, and it's a talk called Security and Automation. And in that talk, I give a scenario of showing how DevOps and automation can work together by talking about a security compliance engineer named Bessie, who is the ruffled lady to the left, talking with engineers in order to collaborate and make a tool to automate the vulnerability management process and move it just a little bit forward. Because, DevOps and tooling equal progress, right? Q 7 years later, I go from being engaged at that talk to being now married with a child, and a bunch of other things that have happened. And I also learned a bit more about vulnerability management. Sorry, y'all, I'm nervous. And I learned that 2017 me was really too high level and didn't explain or show the nuance and complexity of a true vulnerability management process. There's a whole lot more workflows and thought involved. So this talk is going to give that nuance. I've separated it into different sections, talking about the bad and the ugly, because we need to talk about that in order to move forward, and for y'all to understand what we're going through right now, because it's not just security people. We're in this together. I talk about, and then we're going to go into the good, and then showing you what the process is like so you can understand it and be able to work more with security people such as myself. Excuse me. So, let's talk about the bad, which is figuring out vuln management. And because in a world things are more complex and you need to understand what the definition of vulnerability management is, because that's going to be critical in a world that's complex and now is just not full of application vulnerabilities, but system vulnerabilities and container vulnerabilities and SaaS vulnerabilities, right? So this is the least jargony thing I could find. Like, when I first started really diving in and being like, what is vulnerability management? There wasn't really a clear-cut answer. So this is the one that I found that made the most basic sense, which is vulnerability management is the practice of staying aware of known vulnerabilities in an environment and then resolving or mitigating these vulnerabilities to improve the environment's overall security posture. And it's definitely something that we need, right? Like, even now, we're literally hit with supply chain attacks every single day. Even in this great state of Minnesota, some of our critical organizations, like education, Like Minneapolis Public Schools and Minnesota Department of Education both got hit with attacks from one piece of software that led to data breaches. Even in my job, you run into so many things across the complex landscape that can cause incident response, whether it results in a data breach or not. I want y'all to keep that in mind, or not. So there's definitely a need to be aware, and we need to make it a practice. That's the important thing about it. However, I feel like most people are just focused on staying aware. They're not focused on the practice, which is how we keep safe, which is how we improve. Which leads me to the next thing, the ugly. Security in the industry overall does not make that easier. It doesn't. Most of the standards that we rely on are compliance standards that are great, but are also based in enterprise, who have more resources, who have more things to be kind of on it. And even then, they have their own problems. But then there's a mismatch for the smaller companies, the companies that are not enterprise worldwide level, that are Google level. You have startups, you have medium-sized companies, you have like under 1,000 or 1,000 companies that need solutions too, and you have these compliance things and these tools saying, hey, that security is guaranteed. We can provide resources and tooling and automation and things to make you successful, to not even need the extra headcount that you need for security. Because especially for startups, they're all about trying to keep a budget, right? But all of that in reality is just talk. Because ultimately, it's not just the tools, it's trying to be efficient with those tools. And don't get me wrong, like, there are things that our teams can do, but vendors aren't completely clean about this too. UIs can be very, very confusing. Working with security vendors, even security people don't like. Sometimes their documentation can miss things. Sometimes talking with their teams, despite you asking over and over again, and despite telling them over and over again, hey, I do not use Jira. Yes. They don't get the message. And then it ultimately makes my job harder because then it's also just me alone feeling like I'm in a silo because I can't disseminate the information that I'm getting from this tooling in an efficient way to engineers and to people beyond engineers. Because remember, incidents are happening, and it is more than just the engineers who are concerned about it. It's the company too. But that leads me to the good. What can we be hopeful about? Because there is more awareness that we are fighting these bugs, that we are quickly patching behind the scenes, that we are doing the incident response. Security has become more of a topic, especially as it's come up more in media. So that means it's on the minds of people, which leads more people in the company to have concerns. Again, it's beyond the engineers now. Now marketing cares about it. Now sales cares about it. If there is a breach, the company is wanting to know, how are we going to respond to this, and how are we going to ensure that our recovery ensures we have the continued trust of our customers? Because it's not, another thing I want to bring up is, with security breaches, at some point they're going to happen on small scales or big scales. And at this point, it's the way we respond to restore trust and how quickly we do it. That's what's going to assure trust for people. And we also have a few security vendors actually trying to step up to the plate and do right and give out security tooling on top of building the vendor-customer relationships. And I feel like that's getting easier despite, things getting like capitalism capitalizing and acquiring security companies like Infinity Stones. But, we're making progress. Like, people are realizing, especially even with the basic DevOps tools we have, especially in observability, like, security is becoming more of a concern and being folded into the general engineering processes. So, now talking about all of that, let's get back to vulnerability management and what we need to think about, or what I think about as a security practitioner when trying to make it a practice. So here's kind of the breakdown. And I have it this way where it's treeing in instead of going round robin, because I know this is going to be a circular process, but sometimes things come out of order in the practice. So you have collaboration with the business, sourcing vulnerabilities, reporting and tracking vulnerabilities, and then the review and action, not just of the vulnerabilities themselves, but also of your practice. So first you have collaboration with the business. And I think this is the most DevOpsy thing, and also a thing I know not all security people are great at. I'm gonna be honest, we're not all of them. Not all of them. And when I say collaborate, I mean by building relationships, because by building these relationships, we start to understand the business so we can respond to their needs. We start to understand routines. I didn't refresh my page, so I'm gonna move it forward. But one of the routines that I wanted to show is that, at the bottom slide it says, we understand things like scope and asset tracking with the routines too. I have it out of scope of my talk, but it's out of scope for this talk, but it's still really, really important, and it could be another talk in itself. But most companies already have this in some form. But ultimately, it's also having the rapport with those relationships to ask further questions when you get stuck as a security practitioner. And also, we give the rapport for others in the company to ask questions and to also push back, because sometimes security people need that push, like to remember that we're working for the business. And sometimes we also need to push back because we want the business to be successful and secure, but we have to have that push and pull. And by doing that, as a part of our process, we can already add established routines to our vulnerability management practice. And also we can create tighter feedback loops when we're rolling out new parts and processes to the practice. So now let's talk about sourcing. And I think this is probably the most important thing that I learned when trying to develop a practice. Thinking about how and where we source vulnerability informations. And I mean, not just for applications, but also for servers, virtual machines, containers, both on-prem and in the cloud, because yes, that still exists. And then specifically for machine and container-based vulnerabilities, how are we handling that at scale? Are we just going per machine or container image, by vulnerability, or something entirely different? That's going to be up to your business. And for the sourcing tools that we're using, are there available ways to source that information in a programmatic way? Does the source allow API calls or certain integrations that are connected to your company? If it doesn't, does it export in data formats that allow you to get the data you need into your system so you can report and track it? Because that's important to the reporting and tracking step. Because we need to figure out where we're putting the data we're sourcing, because we have to track it for auditing purposes and for security purposes, and also for y'all to fix them. And it doesn't have to be complex from the start. When I was at my last job, when we were smaller, it was just me starting from a spreadsheet. But eventually, though, you'll grow out of that really quickly. So you need to figure out a way to automate that process, which is where the sourcing answers come into play. Because along with those answers, you have data to help with the following questions, such as, does the ticketing or accounting system you're looking at allow for certain classifiers and tags? Some software does not do that well. Can you attach reports that you get from your sources? And is there a way for folks not to have to go into the reporting and tracking system in order to send updates or change statuses? Because that's important. Some people want to save themselves some clicks, and I agree with that. Last thing, review and action. And as I said before, we're thinking about it in the short term with the day-to-day vulnerability management, as well as the long term of how we improve on our practice. So short term is how are we reviewing vulnerabilities? How are we, and when I say review, I mean reviewing the vulnerabilities and from there prioritizing them. Who's doing that reviewing? Because sometimes security teams are tiny enough at smaller companies where we do need engineering help. And we also do need engineering expertise. How are we remediating vulnerabilities? Is it a specific engineering team that does it? Or is it round robin between security teams? Or is it per product team? That's also going to be dependent on how your org is structured and what your goals are on maintaining software, which you should be thinking about. What's the timing based off of severity, which is the most common way to review and prioritize vulnerabilities? If it's a critical vulnerability, how quick are you going to get to it? And also, reminder, that's going to be different for applications versus something like a server or a container, which may take a longer time to patch or remediate or figure out. And then, what if we can't fix it? What if this is something this is our service that can absolutely not go down and we haven't put in the stuff yet to fix it? How do we manage accepting that risk and or mitigating the blast radius of that risk? And if we can't, do we have processes in place to be hey, we're going to accept it for now, but come back to it? How do we report and track that? And then the final thing, which is the most spiciest thing I have for y'all, is what are some vulnerabilities that we don't care about or that are consistently low risk? There are some of those vulnerabilities that you put off because you're just we are not impacted by this. Some people are I don't care about DDoS resource-intensive stuff because it's we're in the cloud. We have protections. But you really need to think about that and point it out. And also just review it too and be okay, we're not going to care about this now, but we're going to review it later. And this is where the long term comes in. Because the long term determines, hey, what metrics are we using to gauge the success of the practice or the program, which is the more formal word for it. And how often are we checking in with the company on the health of the program? Because that's important, to check those metrics, to check, hey, the accepted vulnerabilities, are they still acceptable? Do we still need them? For the vulnerabilities that we don't care about, do we need to care about them now? Based off of our recent IR stuff? And that's not just important for the company. It's also important for compliance operations. But again, we should be thinking beyond that. Like, that's specific to the company. Because again, it's not just securities risk, it's company risk. So, in review, vulnerability management is complex. It's gotten more complex now. But more security concern will improve it. But in order to make that security concern stick, we have to make vulnerability management a collaborative practice. No, again, a collaborative practice. That means engineers have to work with us. And also that security people have to work with engineers. Like, because that is security's job, is to balance business and security need. And sometimes those two are going to butt heads, but that's what building a relationship is about. Because when there's rupture, we want to repair, right? So, one more thing. I know I still was a little bit high level, y'all. I'm sorry about that. You know, I only have 30 minutes to talk with you. So what I did was create a little one-pager to go into a little bit more detail. In this repo, there's also a little QR code. I hope to add a little bit more examples as far as timelines so people can kind of more understand how that works and also how to frame it so you just also have a little bit of wiggle room in your policy. But I'm hoping that that fixes one thing I see, which is, hey, how do we start on the day-to-day? Because anything I've looked at right now really doesn't show that base of how to do things day-to-day and actually write down the policy so that it makes sense. So there you go. And thank you so much. It's been a joy and a pleasure.